Welcome to a really sunny Morley, certainly can't complain about the weather. This morning we're just going to take some time to take you through the 2025 recommended list varieties. When considering your varieties, you'll probably look at the recommended list and you'll see them ranked based on yield. We have some higher yielding varieties that sort of sit over 100% of the control yield, and then that drops away till about 88%. But that isn't the only thing we should be considering. Some of those lower yielding varieties bring other benefits. We think about specialist traits, we think about their disease score, there's lots of other things to consider rather than just yield alone, and that's something we'll discuss this morning. So when we're thinking about varieties, one of the first things we're going to think about is drilling date. Some varieties can't be early sown, so they can't be sown before mid-March. They have a nice big red cross next to them on the recommended list or on our signs here. Really mustn't sow them before mid-March. I know I've said it, but it is really important. You'll get a lot of bolters, you'll have a lot of problems. But there's also an opportunity here. You could order a couple of varieties on farm. Maybe you want to order a variety that is suitable for early sowing, and then some of our higher yielding varieties that aren't so suitable for early sowing can then be kept for when you drill later. Then we're starting to think a little bit further through the season. So probably the next thing we're really considering is when we've got a nice good crop that's well established like this, is some of our disease scores. So on the recommended list, we have scores for rust, powdery mildew and Cercospora. The Cercospora data is a little bit limited at the moment, so it's more of a guide. And I'd really encourage you this year to go out, look at your canopies, understand the disease pressures on farm. The recommended list obviously has a lot of trials across the UK, but they're not always going to represent exactly what's going on in your field, on your land and year to year. So really encourage you when you're thinking about spraying and you're going out this year putting your fungicides on, just to keep tabs on what varieties you've got where, the disease pressures on those. For example, you might have a variety that's very susceptible to rust. You might have a lot of rust on farm and you're not so concerned about powdery mildew, or it could be the other way around. The disease scores do vary quite a bit, particularly some of the high yielding varieties have quite low scores on some of the diseases. So if we're particularly thinking about lifting late, where you might have to think about doing a 3 spray fungicide programme, we might want to be choosing varieties based on their disease score rather than yield alone. So I've just mentioned that there's quite a lot of variety in the scores on the list. So some disease scores are sort of below 4. There's a few, 3 or 4 varieties that sit under that for both rust and powdery mildew. The Cercospora scores are a bit higher, but again, that's sort of a limited data set. And over the years, that will be refined and we'll have more data on that. Good point as well for me to mention that it's worth looking and monitoring for your Cercospora using the BBRO and Cercospora monitoring platform that we have. And then linking that with the variety performance you have on farm as well. We're always interested to hear about how your varieties are performing. Also, another really interesting advancement in varieties is the introduction of Keimer KWS. This is a variety that can be used where we have a lot of Cercospora. It shows that it performs well even under high levels of Cercospora infection, and it's definitely one to consider. If you're in an area that has sort of the high humidity, warm patches, or even within fields that are very sheltered that might have a bit of a microclimate, thinking about that variety selection, maybe Keimer's one for you. While we're talking about diseases as well and specialist traits, another one to consider is Maruschka. It's been on the list for a couple of years now. So this offers resistance to the beet mild yellowing virus, and there is also some evidence that it performs slightly better under beet yellows virus. Again, like all variety traits, I fully understand it can be quite difficult. You're trying to predict ahead to what the pressures might or might not be. But once again, it's a really good opportunity to maybe reflect on what varieties you've had on farm, what your pest and disease pressure has been in previous years, and trying to tailor your variety selection based on that. So if you're in an area where we've got really high levels of virus, potentially next year where there might be less control options, maybe Maruschka's a really good option for you and something to seriously consider. A really exciting observation from the recommended list is the performance of the BCN varieties. So we've just touched on the fact that Maruschka have different trait options that are a little bit lower yielding compared to the rest of the varieties on the recommended list. But that isn't the case for the BCN varieties. So 3 out of the 4 top yielding varieties on the current RL have the BCN trait. They're a really good option if you've got beet cyst nematode in the field. They'll still perform well and yield well. They really show the story as well of how when traits come in, there's a little bit of a yield lag. But over time, as the traits get bred into higher performing lines and genetics, we actually end up with varieties that are both high yielding and have the traits that we want. This is really good news. It means Maruschka and the virus genetics in time that will be a mainstream aspect of the RL. We'll have a lot of varieties that have those sorts of genetics that yield well, and the same for the Cercospora. And there's also the opportunity potentially in the future for some varieties to have both of these traits. Our final specialist trait to think about is AYPR. So if you're aware you have the more aggressive strain of Rhizomania on farm, then Osprey is the variety that's on offer for you. It's the only AYPR variety on the list, but you'll be really glad to hear that it yields really well. It's in the middle of the recommended list, so it is still a good option even if you're in that situation. Those of you that are interested in the Conviso Smart system, so there's 3 varieties. They are similarly yielding when we look at the RL data, but it is important to bear in mind that's done with conventional chemistry, not with the Conviso system. So if you have got Smart Beet on farm this year and you are using Conviso, it's definitely worth going out and seeing how yours are performing and what you think. And then when you come to look at this year's varieties, you can make a decision from there. It's also a really good opportunity to mention, obviously not drilling early with your Conviso varieties and making sure that we have control of bolters. Being honest, we did have some bolters here. It happens. It's the year where we have had a few bolters. We've been out pulling them. We've got good control now as well. So it's just something to bear in mind. It's a really important part of the stewardship. It's a really, really valuable technology, and we all need to play a part in protecting that and making sure that we're looking after it. So there's a lot of information there, a lot of different things to consider, a lot of trying to see into the future to understand what might or might not work in your system. But just to give you a bit of an idea, if I was walking along here looking at the different scores, looking at the varieties, I'd be looking for a nice, vigorous, healthy crop, which to be fair, this year we really do have, which is great to see. I'd then probably be considering when I'm thinking of lifting, am I an early lifter or a late lifter? If I'm lifting early, I'm maybe not quite so concerned about my disease scores, probably a couple of fungicides in, then the beet's out the ground, I'm not worrying about it. However, if I'm late lifting, I'm going to be a little bit more concerned about my disease scores. I'm going to go in and think maybe I've got to do 3 fungicides, and I also want good intervals between those, so I want a nice healthy canopy in the early part of next year. That's a real key one to think about. But of course, also bear in mind that varieties can perform differently depending on soil type. It's very nutrition driven, so if we've got a good nutritious soil, we'll often have really big vibrant canopies, and sometimes the differences you'll see at our demo sites won't be quite as pronounced. Real key point as well is there is different colours, so some varieties are just naturally paler than others. It doesn't mean they're going to perform badly, it doesn't mean they're going to yield less, it's just how the genetics are. Really key one if you have potentially got a mix of varieties in field. Not suggesting we're mixing varieties in the hopper, but you might have drilled your headlands different to the main part of the field with different varieties. Don't panic if there is a bit of a colour difference. It's not due to nitrogen, it is purely just due to the genetics of the plant. So I hope that's been really helpful today. As I said before, there's a lot to consider, but the real key message, if you only take one thing from this, is to go out, look at your varieties, look how they're performing. If you've got a really good performing variety that's available again for next year, no reason not to go with that. But I would also encourage you to try something new, to get some new genetics on farm and see how that performs as well. But yeah, get out there, go and have a look. And also we're always here to help, and we'd love to welcome you to some of the demo strips to have a look at these varieties.